I'm pleased to join you today at the virtual launch of the program's extension of the European Union's support to higher education in ASEAN region, EU Share.
300 students will benefit from new intra-ASEAN scholarships by the end of 2022.
And I'm convinced that the 2-year extension of SHARE will take us further in building the ASEAN higher education space and fostering the leaders and workforce of tomorrow toward greater socioeconomic growth and recovery across the ASEAN region.
SHARE is the largest higher education cooperation program underway in ASEAN.
His Excellency Ambassador Igor Drismans, European Union Ambassador to ASEAN, His Excellency Mr. Ekapap Pandawong, Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN for the ASEAN Sociocultural Community, Mr. Thibault Portevin, Head of Cooperation Delegation of the European Union to ASEAN, Dr. Roger Chao Jr., Assistant Director and Head of Education, Youth and Sports Division of the ASEAN Secretariat, Mr. Darren McDermott, Chair Team Leader, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the opening session of the Share Policy Dialogue 13 today. The 13th Policy Dialogue implemented by the SHARE program and its partners brings together key stakeholders to share information, exchange views, and propose strategies for university and employer engagement to enhance graduate employability in ASEAN. Today, we are honored to have the presence of the European Union Ambassador to ASEAN, His Excellency Mr. Igor Drismans, to open this event with his welcome message. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency Ambassador Igor Drismans.
Good afternoon, His Excellency Mr. Ekapap Pandawong, Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN, officials from the ASEAN Secretariat, ASEAN SomEd leaders and their representative, Mr. Darren McDermott, Share Team Leader, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 13th Share Policy Dialogue organized by the EU Support to Higher Education in ASEAN Region, or SHARE program. It is great to see the participation of all key stakeholders in this policy dialogue, including the private sector community. Education and training has been one of the hardest hit sectors during the pandemic, with more than 90% of the world's students unable to attend school at the height of the health crisis. For this reason, partnerships between higher education institutions and the private sector in the region is crucial in contributing to graduate employability. These partnerships are necessary to bridge the gap between the skills of our graduates and those required in the labor market. In order to increase the employability of graduates, it is essential to have the insights of employers' expectations from higher education graduates. In Europe, we're also undertaking reforms and innovations in our education and training systems, both to increase the quality and also to better match requirements of the employers. We have to ensure that the curriculum offered in universities responds to the needs of the labor market. Now, aside from the formal curriculum, providing regional exposure to students and graduates through apprenticeships or traineeships will also equip them with real-life work experience that could increase their employability. The role of qualification frameworks in supporting lifelong learning and mobility at all levels of education is essential. They can be used as a translation device to make qualifications more understandable to employers, to individuals and institutions across countries, systems and sectors. ASEAN-wide employability will eventually contribute to the mobility and connectivity of ASEAN people, hence would lead to a more integrated ASEAN as a regional community. I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate the SHARE program for organizing this policy dialogue and on the launch of the Community of Practice of ASEAN Higher Education Harmonization. Thank you to all speakers and participants for joining us today, and I wish you all a very productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Drismans, for warmly opening our event today. We are pleased to welcome Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN for the ASEAN Sociocultural Community, His Excellency Mr. Ekapap Pandawong, to also deliver his welcome message. DSG Ekapap, allow me to hand over the floor to you, please.
His Excellency Igor Drismans, European Union Ambassador to ASEAN, leaders and focal points of the ASEAN Senior Officials Meeting on Education, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am delighted to welcome all of you today to the 13th Shared Policy Dialogue on University and Employer Engagement to enhance graduate employability in ASEAN. I thank the European Union for their continued support through the EU Shared Program. I commend the EU Share team and its partners for organizing this event and for placing the focus on a very timely issue. Ladies and gentlemen, youth unemployment has been a long-standing issue in ASEAN. In 2020, International Labour Organization reported that youth are 3 times more likely to be unemployed compared to those aged 25 and above. The fourth industrial revolution, or the 4IR, further aggravated the risk of job displacement due to the utilization of the technology and automation. Recently, this is exacerbated by the massive job losses worldwide as the COVID-19 pandemic continues. Global shifts and trends in recent decades, such as economic and industrial transformation and globalization, have demanded the transformation of education systems, and the inability to do so have resulted in the mismatch between the skills supply and demand across Asia. This as a phenomenon has resulted in the perception that formal education itself is not sufficient for ASEAN youth to join the labor market. Our labor market has been changing rapidly and will continue to change to meet the evolving demands for the relevant skills and competencies required by the changing world of work. This has increased the urgency of transforming our education system to address the skills gap through incorporating the relevant curriculum which will equip our youth with the necessary skills and competencies to be adaptable and resilient in the face of the future uncertainty. Therefore, in moving forward, university and the employer engagement is not just an option, but a necessity to produce a competitive and future-ready workforce. Ladies and gentlemen, human resources development has always been the heart of the ASEAN social, cultural communities' effort to realize an inclusive, sustainable, resilient, and dynamic community. In 2015, the ASEAN leaders adopted the Kuala Lumpur Declaration on Higher Education to recognize the important role that higher education plays in ensuring the competitiveness of ASEAN and its sustained development. This declaration also underlines the ASEAN's vision and commitment in building an innovation-driven ASEAN community with strengthened human resources and regional identity through the internationalization and harmonization of ASEAN higher education. I therefore look forward to fruitful discussions on the contribution of the internationalized higher education to the employability of university graduates during today's session of the policy dialogue. I am pleased to note that a study which aims to assess the contribution of the student mobility to graduate employability in ASEAN is currently being conducted by EU Share. The study is expected to provide a baseline in establishing the future intra-ASEAN student mobility, internship, and alumni programs. In 2020, the ASEAN leaders adopted the ASEAN Declaration on Human Resources Development for the changing world of work. It highlighted the importance of interconnectivity between the education system and the labor market demand amongst its key priorities. I am therefore pleased to note that our session tomorrow will also engage employers to discuss ways to align the higher education curriculum with the labor market. Ladies and gentlemen, this three-day policy dialogue is designed to provide a platform for the regional higher education stakeholders to share their insights on tackling the skills gap and increasing the employability of graduates through the enhancement of higher education system. I am very happy to see the diverse education stakeholders from across the globe, including the policymakers, university representatives, employers, and student alumni in this virtual policy dialogue. Despite having to convene virtually, I am hopeful that this virtual dialogue will meet its objectives and reach a wider audience. I trust that our discussion during this 3 days of policy dialogue will be able to generate valuable insights, particularly in ensuring the productivity and the competitiveness of our region through the higher education. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DSG ECAPHub. Now we will invite Mr. Darren McDermott, the team leader of the SHARE program, to also say a few words this afternoon. Darren, the stage is yours.
Many thanks, Uni. Your Excellency Igor Driesmans, Ambassador of the EU Delegation to ASEAN. Your Excellency Ekapab Pantabong, Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN for the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. Head of Cooperation of the EU Delegation to ASEAN, Mr. Thibaut Portavan, and Head of Education, Youth and Sports Division of the ASEAN Secretariat, Dr. Roger Chao Jr., and representatives of the ASEAN Secretariat, senior officials and representatives of ASEAN member states, ministries of education, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this, the 13th SHARE Policy Dialogue. This 3-day event will explore the topic of enhancing graduate employability through university and employer engagement. Our keynote speakers will cover the global and regional context of embedding employability in the university curriculum and how employers and universities can collaborate more effectively to enable graduates to make a smoother transition into the workplace. Plenary panel discussions amongst policymakers, higher education practitioners, employers, alumni, and students from across the region will explore the contribution of internationalization to graduate employability, the nexus of higher education and employer collaboration, and the new agenda for graduate skills responding to Industry 4.0. The conference will hear from SHARE Intra-Asian Mobility Scholarship alumni on their employment experiences since graduation and their aspirations for their future working lives. The SHARE program continues its commitment to support the future readiness of ASEAN students and graduates through the implementation of digital modalities of internationalization, such as virtual exchange, collaborative online international learning, and digital credentials. Through this, we aim to contribute to ASEAN's sustainable human development, as set out in the ASEAN Declaration on Human Resources Development for the Changing World of Work 2020 to 2030, and the ASEAN Work Plan on Education 2021 to 2025. I would like to thank the SHARE team and our friends and colleagues who have come together to make this policy dialogue possible. It's our sincere hope that you will draw learning and new insights from these discussions and carry them forward in your own contexts and communities of practice. It's envisaged that sustaining such hybrid dialogues amongst higher education stakeholders employers, alumni, and partners of the ASEAN region will facilitate the inclusive sharing of models, good practices, and experiences in advancing human development in a changed world and an ever-changing world of work. We hope that we will have the opportunity to gather together in person with you as a community once again next year. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Darren. The ASEAN Education Work Plan 2021-2025 identifies actions related to communities of practice in the region's higher education development. Today, we see another milestone of the SHARE program as we launch the SHARE Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice. Allow me now to invite Mr. Thibault Portevin, Head of Cooperation, Delegation of the European Union to ASEAN, to deliver his launch remark.
Thank you and good afternoon, Your Excellency, Mr. Ekapab Pantavong, Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN, Your Excellency Igor Driesman of the EU Delegation to ASEAN, Mr. McDermott of the SHARE program, all partners of the program, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations on the official launch of the ASEAN Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice. I'm pleased to note that the SHARE program has organized various sessions of communities of practice workshops with partner universities. It's great that diverse actions have been planned in the SHARE community of practice on ASEAN higher education harmonization, including virtual exchanges and collaborative online learning, for example. Policymakers and practitioners of the communities of practice will facilitate the transfer of knowledge and management at policy and institutional levels. This will contribute to harmonized ASEAN higher education. A regional higher education space, and I speak from our European experience, will be beneficial for inter-regional cooperation. The EU is very proud to support this process in ASEAN through the SHARE program. I hope in particular that the Committee of Practice will support the sustainability of the SHARE program beyond the program completion at the end of 2022. I can only concur that it's important to allow all stakeholders to engage in intra-regional and inter-regional networking. You can count on the EU to support this ambition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thibault. Today, we are joined by Dr. Roger Chao, Jr., Assistant Director and Head of Education, Youth and Sports Division of the ASEAN Secretariat, to also say a few words on the launch of the SHARE Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice. Dr. Roger?
Okay. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies. Ambassador Igor Driesman, EU Ambassador to ASEAN, the Deputy Secretary General Ekapab Pantavong, Deputy Secretary for ASEAN Sociocultural Community, ladies and gentlemen, fellow friends and stakeholders in the education sector, good afternoon. I am extremely pleased that the EU and through the EU Share program has launched the Communities of Practice. I understand that the community of practice gathers key stakeholders from the grassroots, from the ground, actual practitioners to create, share, develop expertise, enhance access, and curate resources, innovate knowledge, contribute ideas and activities to support the harmonization of ASEAN higher education. Furthermore, the importance of a community of practice goes beyond the exchange of ideas within the community, but actually the unity and collaboration between practice and policy. It contributes to a circle where practitioners, particularly from the communities of practice, contributes to policy making, and policymakers collaborate with the communities of practice to monitor and look into the effectiveness of the policies that are in place. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to congratulate you again on this very important initiative. The communities of practice also contributes to the ASEAN Work Plan 2021, Work Plan on Education 2021-2025, and in particular to the initiatives that are mandated to the ASEAN Working Group on Higher Education Mobility 2025. I look forward to working with all of you. And once again, congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roger. I would like now to give the stage to Darren, the shared team leader, to also deliver his launch remark. Darren.
Many thanks, Uni, and many thanks, Thibaut and Roger, for your very kind words. It's a great pleasure to see the Share Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice launched today. I would like to especially thank Share's consultants, Mr. Andy Gibbs and Dr. Azira Hashim, as well as the steering committee of the Community of Practice, who've contributed their knowledge and experience to bring us to this point today. The Share Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice is just beginning, and I invite all those with an interest in internationalization of higher education in the region to join and contribute and collaborate on the future of higher education.
Thank you very much, Darren. I would like to congratulate the SHARE program on the launch of the SHARE Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice. We wish all the best to this group in sharing the ownership of the ASEAN higher education space development. Before we close the session, I would like to invite to come on stage Ambassador Igor Drismans, Mr. Thibaut, Dr. Roger, and also Darren for a group photo, please. I think we're still missing Ambassador Igor. Okay, on 3, then one of our staff will take a picture. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much. Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for joining our opening session today. I would like now to hand over the floor to my colleague Darren to continue with the next session. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Many thanks, Uni, and thank you all once again for joining us today from across Southeast Asia and further afield. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Michael Murphy, President of the European University Association, who joins us from Cork in Ireland, a fellow Irishman. Dr. Murphy graduated in medicine from University College Cork in 1976, following postgraduate medical training in Dublin and London. He received his doctorate from the National University of Ireland in 1984. A past president of University College Cork, 2007 to 2017, he has been active in many academic organizations in Europe and the United States and has served as Vice Chancellor of the National University of Ireland, Chair of the Health Research Board of Ireland, Chair of the Irish Universities Association, and Chair of the Permanent Working Group of European Hospital Doctors. Michael, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the SHARE Policy Dialogue and looking forward to your thoughts on the contribution of internationalization to graduate employability. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Darren. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. And thank you for the kind invitation to speak. I will try to convey a few key messages over the next 8 minutes or so. We all realize that the world is increasingly globalized, in spite of efforts in a few countries to turn back the clock. But the fact is that the most pressing challenges of our time affect all of us in all parts of the world, and they demand collective, collaborative, global responses. And that means ever deeper transnational engagement. Now, most relevant to your symposium is the fact that an ever larger proportion of business is now organized multinationally. For example, about 1/3 of global production is performed by multinational companies. Here in Europe, 20% of our output is generated by companies where ownership lies outside the individual countries. Now, this is yet less obvious in Southeast Asia, but it is growing rapidly in your region also. And today, some 1/4 of all goods and services produced globally are exported to other countries. The consequence of this is that the global economic trends require workers to interact continuously with international peers within the workplace and to engage with clients across borders, to move between countries in their careers, and to manage ever more multicultural teams. So intercultural understanding and skills, and multilingualism in particular, are essential for success in business and in a harmonious, high-functioning, creative workplace of the 21st century. So to prepare graduates for today's world requires that universities provide extensive inter- and multicultural experience for students, whether undergraduates or postgraduates, and ideally experience in the internationalized workplace. Traditionally, of course, we've sent students to partner universities overseas, and this is a long history and it has a growth trajectory. But it is important to remember that in the eyes of employers, international experience refers to a wide variety of activities, not just international student exchange, student mobility or study abroad as we call it. But employers also value international volunteer work, internships, personal travel, which is often combined with casual employment. And in the universities, we often tend not to focus on the value of these opportunities. Now, there's much written to support the benefits of international experience in enhancing graduate employability. For example, some 10 years ago, Joanna Crossman from Australia, in a large study, reported that all stakeholders, whether employers, academics, or students, identified very clear connections between international experience and employability, from the benefits of transnational networks, opportunities for intercultural experiential learning, language acquisition, and very importantly, the development of soft skills that are related to cultural understanding, such as enhanced communication skills and new ways of thinking. Personal international experience grows graduate capacity to succeed, particularly in strategizing, in problem solving, decision making, innovation, negotiation, conflict resolution, a range of scenarios. But I have too little time this morning to go into detail here. But we must remember that the pandemic and the recent commitments that have been made by all countries at COP26 in Glasgow to embrace sustainable practices in all that we do, these have thrown up new challenges and, of course, new opportunities in shaping future internationalization and enhancement of graduate employability. So now we must focus on the potential for virtual internationalization, opportunities for internationalization at home, the benefits of joint degrees with international partners delivered through cooperative online learning, with staff rather than students being physically mobile. So we must explore the possibilities offered by a new internationalization, including the design of our own domestic university curricula. We realize that traditional mobility has its downsides. It's the preserve of richer students. It has a carbon footprint that is not sustainable if we are to meet the UN SDG goals. It increases the risk that the sending nation will lose its most talented students. And while this loss paradoxically confers economic benefits on a small number of countries, it most often denudes the sending country of economic and social benefits. So the new internationalization model must be infused with solidarity with nations in all parts of the world. A couple of concluding comments. Acquiring a new language, most commonly English, is often a driver of mobility to Anglophone countries in particular, which tend to be the most predatory in retaining international talented students. Today, very many non-native English-speaking countries teach degree programs through English and do so very well, while giving visiting students a second opportunity to pick up a second language, that of the host country. So these countries also very often avoid ghettoization that occurs when very large numbers of international students concentrated together, socialize together, rather than becoming immersed in the host culture. Here in Europe, where we have dozens of languages, we operate quite well with a shared English vocabulary of 1,200 to 1,500 words, and this is worth reflecting on. And finally, it is very important to prioritize internationalization focused on one's region, not exclusively, but primarily, because geopolitical forces today are growing the importance of strong, effective, large regional economies and societies as the best way to strengthen global capacity to address global challenges. Here in the European Union, we are encouraging some 50% of our students to be transnationally mobile in the next decade, but primarily within the EU to grow cohesion. And likewise, the new emerging transnational European university alliances share the same goal. So ASEAN might usefully consider similar approaches for the same good reasons. You trade predominantly with neighboring or regional countries. Your intercultural harmony needs are predominantly regional, so you might consider prioritizing intra-ASEAN mobility, which will also minimize the carbon footprint of internationalization. In a moment, Dr. Sholtis Diratati may well reference a project that we at EUA and AUN, along with global peers, are embarking on right now to create a new opportunity to share better global practices among the world's universities. And the agenda will include new common approaches to internationalization. I see on the clock, Darren, that my 8 minutes are up. I hope that my few remarks help shape some of the discussion later this afternoon. I thank you for inviting me, and I wish you a very successful symposium over the next couple of days. So thank you very much, Darren.
Many thanks, Dr. Murphy, for that extremely comprehensive and context-setting keynote. And I wish we had much more time, but perhaps you'll join us again at the Policy Dialogue and indeed in person in the ASEAN region. Plenty for us to consider as we go into our panel discussion on this theme. And before we do that, I'd now like to hear from one of our alumni and their experiences.
About SHARE's impact on my professional horizons, it's really enriching in the sense that I've had the opportunity to meet friends who now seem to be leaders in their own fields. I'm very proud of them. And also the opportunity to meet high-profile people in different sectors, to the regional events held by SHARE. I'd say having international experiences is a really big plus in my job search and probably everyone's. Our applications are generally favored somehow because of our exposure to different cultures and peoples. I'm currently teaching courses related to language and culture at my university, and I think that quite evidently reflects SHARE's impact on my career choice. Now I'm working in Vietnam, but just a couple of years back, I was working in the Kingdom of Thailand. I'd say that SHARE somehow contributes to the formation of identity, which goes beyond and above national boundaries. I have learned not only to appreciate other cultures, but at the same time learn to reflect on my own culture and my own identity as a person. And my worldview is therefore tremendously broadened, and I really appreciate that.
It's always great to hear from our alumni, and you'll be hearing from many more of them over the course of the next 3 days. So I'd now like to introduce our moderator for our panel discussion on the contribution of internationalization to graduate employability. Dr. Miguel Antonio Lim is a senior lecturer in education at the Manchester Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. And his research has focused on internationalization of higher education, East and Southeast Asian and transnational higher education, and critical perspectives on university rankings and performance metrics. I'm very pleased to say, and as noted by Deputy Secretary General, that Dr. Lim is currently leading a team of ASEAN researchers on a master plan on ASEAN connectivity study on graduate employability in ASEAN, the contribution of student mobility. It's envisaged that the study will further engage higher education institutions across the ASEAN region to collect and analyze student and alumni mobility data, identify partnership opportunities with employers, and determine the role of internships in augmenting graduate employability. And we're very pleased to be commissioning this research as the SHARE program. So Miguel, thanks very much for joining us today. I realize it's a little early in the morning in Manchester, so much appreciated. And over to you to introduce our panel. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Darren. Yes, and a very good morning from Manchester. It's in the early winter, so it is quite early in the morning, but I'm glad really to be again with colleagues in Southeast Asia and to see faces, whether recorded or live, speaking about all the work that's being done in the region. I was particularly excited to see just in the previous video an example already of a ASEAN graduate who's experienced intra-ASEAN mobility, studying at my alma mater, the University of the Philippines, the flagship campus in Diliman, and now working in Vietnam. So I'm glad to introduce our panel on the contribution of internationalization to graduate employability. The purpose of this panel is really to bring policy and academic perspectives together to explore the relationship between internationalization and international student mobility within the ASEAN region, and the employability of those students who experience this mobility. Some of the questions that our panelists will explore and examine are how intra-ASEAN mobility programs prepare these students for, well, the world of work, what specific actions are being taken to boost these international students' employability. We really want to think about whether intra-ASEAN mobility will really help and be attractive to employers and help these graduates wanting to search for jobs within the region, and to study these trends of students who are working in another country. We want to understand what skills are learned in this inter-regional mobility, and what skills and qualities employers really want from these graduates. These and other questions will be discussed by our panel, who include Dr. Choltis Tirathiti. I'll give a brief introduction to each one. He'll be joined by Mr. Roger Chao, Mr. Peter Van Tuyl, and finally Dr. Ramyan Kosaikonod. And let me just briefly read a little bit about our panel members, starting with Dr. Choltis, who is the Executive Director of the ASEAN University Network, which those listening will be very familiar with. It's the intergovernmental organization under the ASEAN Secretariat, bringing together some of the, I suppose, the most the leading universities in the region with regard to internationalization. So Dr. Choltis has been working and teaching in normative political theory at Chulalongkorn University since 1996. He has worked in the public sector in Thailand for a very long time, involving thinking skill training, public sector strategies. He's worked for AUN since 2009, working precisely in one of the schemes that we'll be speaking about today, promoting intra-regional mobility. Dr. Roger Chao is now head of the Education, Youth and Sports Division at the ASEAN Secretariat. Since 2013, he's been engaged in the international education development sector in a range of capacities with UNESCO, UNICEF, the European Commission, the German Academic Exchange Service, or DAAD, the British Council. So he publishes widely in themes of ASEAN and regional higher education issues and studies, where he draws on research that he's done for a very long time, including his research on his PhD at City University in Hong Kong. And also a link to Europe with his master's, the European Masters in Lifelong Learning, from one of my other alma maters, the Danish School of Education at Aarhus University, as well as the University of the Uster in Spain and the Institute of Education, IOE, at London. Peter Van Tuyl is the director of NUFIC, NUFIC NESO, the Netherlands Education Support Office in Indonesia, looking over the work of NUFIC over the region. In Indonesia, Peter has worked for Kemitraan, the Kemitraan Partnership for Governance Reform, and as an advisor to the Indonesian National Police. From 2007 to 2016, he was the executive director of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. Quite important, I would say. And earlier on, he'd worked for Oxfam Novib and was the first executive secretary of the International NGO Forum on Indonesian Development, also widely published on issues surrounding his professional and academic expertise. And last but certainly not the least, Dr. Ramyan Kosaikonod is the Center Director of Simeo Rihed and former Vice President of the International Affairs of International Affairs of Mae Fah Luang University in Thailand. She's also been involved for a very, very long time on internationalization and higher education harmonization processes in Thailand and throughout ASEAN. She's one of the pioneers in establishing the pilot project of inter-regional mobility, the AIMS, which we'll be talking about as well today, the Asian International Mobility for Students program. She regards herself as a feminist economist and has represented women major groups at the UN Conference for Sustainable Development. Well, so it's clearly an amazing panel. And just to introduce the topic for today, I'd like to just begin with a little bit of contextual remarks before we bring in Dr. Choltis. So we know that international student mobility is an important topic, not only in throughout the world, and increasingly so in ASEAN. So recent research has shown that more than 5 million international students travel to other countries for their studies. There's an economic value to this, you might say, to this movement, over 300 billion US dollars. Clearly, the mobility is more than just its economic then there are more than just economic benefits, but we'll be speaking about one of them today, which is about employability and skills growth. However, there are challenges even despite this scale and the growth of this phenomenon in ASEAN, which is that the majority of intra-ASEAN mobility programs tend to be government or region-led. And I think there's scope perhaps for more engagement from universities and students themselves. Sometimes they're limited, or very often they're limited to short-term programs rather than longer-term degree awarding programs, which thus limit the scope as well as the quantity of these kinds of mobilities. And then finally, and I hope this is something that we have to thank the EU for as well in trying to promote this, but however, there's still a lack of sustainable long-term funding to promote this kind of mobility. We know that 90% of ASEAN students still leave the ASEAN region to for those who do pursue international studies, 90% go out of the ASEAN region. So again, this is also a concern for the region. We've had several mobility programs. In 1991, there was the University Mobility in Asia and the Pacific program. 1995, the ASEAN University Network Student Exchange Program. 2009, the ASEAN International Mobility for Students, which Dr. Ramyan was part of. And obviously the previous one in 1995, Dr. Choltis might be able to talk to us about the AUN Student Exchange Program. And finally, in 2015, the EU Share Scholarship as well is one of these initiatives that is promoting intra-regional mobility. So I guess one of the main questions we can think about are these programs and this trend of increasing international student mobility, will they improve the trend of international graduates, ASEAN graduates working in other countries? And perhaps will the trend of ASEAN students working in other countries increase the demand for this kind of mobility within our region? Yes, so with those initial thoughts, I'd like to bring in our first speaker, Dr. Choltis.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I believe that there's a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much. Next, please. Right. 25 years ago, when the ASEAN University Network was set up, what we want to talk about today on the graduate employability is the thing that kind of hidden in the agenda of setting up the AUN. But it doesn't mean that we are not fully aware of the issue. AUN was set up to boost the collaboration among some of the leading university in 10 ASEAN countries to cooperate in pushing forward the socio-economic development of the ASEAN region through the what the university got in their hands. And then 20 years ago, when the AUN started to do the quality assurance system, the so-called the AUNQA, the system and standard that ensure the management and standards of quality within the degree programs or study programs in our universities. From the start, graduate employability was in there and is still in the system until today, that we have been doing a lot of quality assurance assessments. On average, since the lockdown, we have been, since September last year, we have been doing over 200 study programs assessment on average every week. As of now, we are doing it even today through the means of remote site visit, utilizing the internationalized team, mostly or from ASEAN region, team of assessors. Perhaps my next point is that perhaps we are more aware of the issue of graduate employability a few years before the lockdown. That, for example, within AUN, we start up a very discussion, a very self-conscious discussion on graduate employability in the digital age. We started around the year 2017 as partly as a result of what we follow from what they said in the, for example, in the World Economic Forum. Digitalization, digital age, the fourth industrial revolution, or other equivalents of this phenomenon. We AUN discuss on the impacts of these things, from this thing to the higher education, and we're still discussing and doing something about it, particularly in the area of quality assurance. My next point, given the context and development or background that I outlined in the previous three points, is that I think the main problem is very much manifested in terms of the uneven development of our universities in the ASEAN region. Again, mind you that in the ASEAN region, there it depends on how you count it, but some said it's over 4,000 universities in the whole region. Some estimate the number up to maybe 5,000. But the problem is that we have a very uneven state of development when we compare all these universities together, particularly when we want to talk about the practice of the outcome-based education and how we want to have the quality culture, particularly in the study program level. And this problem is where the AUN, with its tools and approach in quality assurance, utilizing the international cooperation, come in to assist. Anyway, back to the graduate employability issues. Recently, the AUN has engaged in sharpening the edge of our discussion. Next slide, please. And as Professor Miguel asked at the final question, what skill or qualities that we need? from the perspective of the ASEAN University Network, we I mean our AUN presidents, rectors, and vice chancellor have collectively identified several issues here. For example, we need to somehow accommodate our high potential students. And another example is how to nurture the next global leaders out of our students, particularly to serve the goal of SDGs and graduates could live or spend their life in a very connected world. And one of the discussion was concentrated on the idea that these things, these knowledge and skills for the next century, or what Professor Michael Murphy just identified as the inter and multicultural experiences. This thing cannot be done without a mobility experience. And our AUN presidents insist on the interaction between other, I mean, for our students to have the interaction with other human beings, with other cultures, with other countries, and even with her or his own locality. That is very important. The so-called experiential learning in a multidisciplinary setting is very crucial to have the in order to have the desirable graduates for the future. And I have half a minute left in my 10 minutes. Our presidents also insist on a paradigm shift in pedagogy, meaning that there must be a change in how we teach from the academic perspective, and how students learn from their perspective, or the so-called self-reliant learning. My time is up. I think I stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Miguel. You are muted, Miguel.
Thank you very much, Choltis. I think some of the issues that you raised are things that we need to talk about. The imbalance, for instance, some of the developmental imbalances in our region. I myself recall my own work in Singapore, where I met people from throughout the region. So there seems to be this trend to the more developed parts. And it's very interesting regarding what you said about changes in pedagogy, which I hope we can discuss further. But now let's move on to Dr. Roger Chao, head of the ASEAN Secretariat for Youth Education.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Well, I'm going to speak from three hats and try to collate everything from an academic perspective, from an education development perspective, and from a policy perspective. So the topic, I want to focus on internationalization and graduate employability, but I want to consider the notion of the ASEAN community building perspective. As we all know, ASEAN has been embarking on ASEAN community building project. Similarly, there is the drive and initiatives to develop an ASEAN higher education space. So there are two different perspectives. You have to take note. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes. The ASEAN community, with the theme of one vision, one identity, and one community, actually has three pillars: the ASEAN political security community, the ASEAN economic community, and the ASEAN sociocultural community. Underneath are the key directives of what, descriptions of what each particular pillar aims to be. But in education, we are normally engaged in the ASEAN sociocultural community, which looks into enhancing the full potential of ASEAN citizens, um, looking towards inclusive, sustainable, resilient, dynamic, and harmonization within the countries and the region. At the same time, the core of human resource development and the development of ASEAN citizens are also linked up to the ASEAN economic community, in particular, with the development of the ASEAN Free Trade Area. Take note, which is not only in terms of goods or investments, but also in skilled labor, capital, and services, including education. It's also linked to the ASEAN political security community, but to a lesser extent. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the core developments in terms of ASEAN community building is the free movement of goods, services, investment, skilled labor, and capital. In my own work published in 2017, I have argued that mobility, mutual recognition of higher education qualifications, but I would like to extend further that also includes TVET and skills recognition contribute significantly to the ASEAN regional integration project. In particular, mobility and mutual recognition facilitates identity formation, promoting ASEAN awareness, and creating a sense of community. So in fact, when we talk about students from one ASEAN member state to another member state, they get engaged and immersed in multiple cultures, multiple practices, multiple religious beliefs. And this, to a certain extent, contributes to reflection, self-reflection, and how to better understand and engage with our own ASEAN neighbors. On the third point is that I also argue that international student and professional mobility, take note, I included professional mobility, actually enhances intercultural and social awareness and understanding, which are extremely important in relation to ASEAN community building, particularly in relation to ASEAN's identity formation role. However, the level of intra-ASEAN mobility is still significantly low, and the initiative to develop and further promote intra-ASEAN student mobility is actually a welcome initiative. Can we go to the next slide? Since the topic is about internationalization and graduate employability, let me put it into the context. What exactly do we mean by internationalization of higher education? Instead of going through the exercise of putting the definitions, I actually put the definitions before, but I decided to take it out due to the interest of time. Normally, what we see is internationalization abroad. Students, faculty, researchers moving from their home country to a host country, be it within the region or outside the region. Okay. There are also the notion of establishing satellite or branch campuses within the country or franchise programs. That can be, well, it's debatable if it's considered abroad or internationalization at home. The other point that I would like to highlight is that internationalization is not all about mobility. Virtual mobility is now something that has been incorporated and advocated since COVID-19 pandemic started. But another important aspect is internationalization at home. The internationalization of the curriculum, including incorporating international aspects of the curriculum. Talk about virtual mobility, which can be considered mobility to a certain extent because you do experience certain cultures, get an exchange of knowledge, but to a lesser extent when you're actually moving the traditional way. Within internationalization at home, there is such a thing called comprehensive internationalization, which incorporates internationalization experience, curriculum, and almost everything into the whole student experience, be it either, let's say, a student from the University of the Philippines or an exchange student goes there, the student services, the food, culture, dormitory facilities, and student life are internationalized to a certain extent. I wouldn't go in depth to all these things because 10 minutes will not be enough. But I just want to contextualize that internationalization of higher education is much more than just faculty, student, and researcher mobility. Next slide, please. Now, going into internationalization and graduate employability, what is important? This is from my experience as an international student, my experience working as a researcher, as an academic in the development field, and now working at the ASEAN Secretariat. We have to consider that graduate employability should be seen in multiple dimensions at the local level, national level, regional level, and global level. Because the skills and competencies required at each level, or even within different sectors, are completely different. Essentially, if you're going to go for internationalization, you get too internationalized and you go back to the national, and to a certain extent, especially if you go to the local context, it is a little bit more difficult for you to actually find work because your mindset, your experience is too broad, and they would find it a little bit, the employers would find it resistance because you're either overqualified or you don't fit into the mold. Now, when we're talking about internationalization and graduate employability, I'd like to point out at least 5 core areas that I'd like to highlight. Professional skills and competencies, basically hard skills, in relation to what sector that you actually intend to work in, be it at the national, regional, or global level. Then we also have to we also have to look at interpersonal competencies, intercultural competencies, which the students actually, or even faculty actually learns through exchange and through internationalization, the international experience. Then the global region and regional perspective from the mobility and it also enhances the perspective of the student. And then you have the notion of socio-cultural capital, the networks, the experiences that you experience through internationalization is actually very important. Can we go to the next slide? Next slide. Can we go? Next slide, please. One more. This particular slide and the other slide talks about the core importance of internationalization. The first slide before was Dr. Jones, Professor Jones was actually talking about graduate employability because of internationalization, but then argues that there's a need for focus on internationalization at home. The previous one is a book published in 2019 looking at miscellaneous case studies showing that internationalization actually contributes to graduate employability. Now, let's talk about ASEAN. ASEAN Declaration on Higher Education Declaration for a Changing World of Works recognizes the importance of qualifications, alignment, and regional building, and harmonization of these qualifications. Such a thing, regional competency frameworks looks at competencies required for certain professions, such as the ASEAN architect, the ASEAN engineer. Mutual recognition agreements has been agreements between ASEAN member states to recognize the professionals within certain mechanisms, which builds into the ASEAN Register for Professionals, similar to the ASEAN engineers that I mentioned earlier. Now we have the ASEAN Working Group on Higher Education Mobility, which has been established earlier this year, which focus on developing an intra-ASEAN scholarship scheme, defining and promoting an ASEAN higher education space, which also works within various aspects related to harmonization of ASEAN higher education, which includes ASEAN Qualifications Reference Framework, ASEAN Quality Assurance Framework, and ASEAN Credit Transfer Systems, which includes a digital credit transfer system. Take note, it is not just the working group that's working in it, but all other groups that's working on various aspects. As I mentioned earlier, the communities of practice contributes and can contribute to the developments leading towards an ASEAN higher education space, but it also contributes back towards implementation and feedback loop towards the development of policies at regional level. Next slide, please. So basically, thank you for your attention. 8 to 10 minutes is too short, but I hope I've covered a lot of ground to give you an understanding of internationalization and graduate employability, and then in relation to ASEAN community building and the various aspects and initiatives that ASEAN Secretariat through the Education, Youth and Sports Division is undertaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roger. I agree with you that the 10 minutes is certainly not enough to discuss the topic. I am really glad that we have a ASEAN Secretariat perspective on these things, and I was very interested with regard to some of the points that you mentioned. Internationalization is not all about mobility, and thinking about these policies, it is actually something to think about regarding the potential for virtual mobility, how these will change the thinking and the policies of ASEAN, the readiness of ASEAN universities and ASEAN employers with respect to new forms of mobility and virtualization, I think is something that we should discuss maybe at this forum, but also in future events. I think that's really important. But now I'd like to
Yes, exactly.
move on. We'll discuss it in our kind of group Q&A in just a short while. But now we can move on to Peter Van Tuyl, who'll be talking about the EU Share scholarships. So the scholarships, I understand, are the main instruments to achieve some of the EU Share program's main goals, which include strengthening regional cooperation in ASEAN, supporting harmonization, and boosting regional mobility. So, and it would be interesting to see what Peter thinks about the role of scholarships in promoting these goals and how they interact with each other. What I understand from the latest available data is that since its launch in 2015, 591 students from 8 of the ASEAN member states, so not yet quite all the ASEAN member states, have been awarded mobility scholarships at 32 participating universities. Let's ask Peter and hear more from him about the program.
Sure. Thank you very much, Miguel. What a pleasure and an honor to be here this afternoon. Let's go to my first slide. You are totally up to date with the statistics about our scholarship program, but in my talk, I will try to relate it to the issue of employability. So let's talk about work, first of all, and some changes in the nature of work that we see. Also in ASEAN, but worldwide, actually. First of all, the purpose of work for many people is expanding. People, of course, still are seeking an income, but increasingly people are looking for societal and positive environmental impact. We see this in the startup scene in Southeast Asia, where young people are active. Yes, they want to make money, but they're also working on waste management, clean water, environmental sustainability in all sorts of ways. And if you look at the big companies, the big employers, they do the same. They have to go beyond corporate social responsibility and really change the nature of how they produce, where they produce. The accountability and the public scrutiny is much larger than before. And that is, we can make use of the impact of technology. Digitalization was already mentioned also in the context of education. Knowledge is becoming more interdisciplinary, the knowledge that we need. We need to work in hybrid teams. Michael Murphy was talking about it, and also Roger just now. We need different social and behavioral skills and different language skills. Next slide, please. So what are employment areas relevant for ASEAN? Just to name a few here. First, there is the issue of sustainable food production. The COVID pandemic has all the more emphasized for all of us and for governments also that our population needs to be healthy. This is really important. And by making our food production more sustainable, we can reduce the carbon footprint, we can reduce waste, and we can bring the Sustainable Development Goals closer. ASEAN is a region particularly prone for sustainable food production, for better food production. It's very fertile. There's a lot of work and a big part of the economy to be further developed, has a lot of potential still. Collaborating in research and in the knowledge sector to produce innovation, very important and very much related to mobility, which helps to create this competencies to work in a hybrid teams across cultures. Renewable energy is important, and also care work will be important in ASEAN because the population of ASEAN is graying. Next slide, please. Now, the connection between education and work is, of course, not immediately evident. Education itself does not produce labor demand, but what we're looking at, referring to several of the previous speakers, is how education can shape people that innovate, that apply knowledge to solve problems and to perform complex tasks. And the key curriculum challenge is for everyone to learn to live well with technology, to use technology in a way that it gives meaning to a production process. The institutional challenge is how to build public-private partnerships, how we can get people out of their sphere just in government or just in the private sector, because we need both, and we need to cross the bridge between the two of them. And the key outcome that we want is green skills, how people can look at whatever they do in their work, in their job, in order to help to contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and create a green economy. Next slide, please. Now, the role of mobility, Miguel, that you were asking about, this is definitely what we have seen with the almost 600 scholarships that we were happily allowed to share in the ASEAN region. It takes people out of their comfort zone if you're mobile. And in all of the evaluations of scholarships programs that we do, including SHARE, you see that the life experience is as important and perhaps sometimes even more important than what you learn in a university. It is going to another country, learning another language, seeing other people, or as the Vietnamese alumni was saying it in the video, making new friends. And that's how we can also learn how to create shared digital knowledge, how we can build those competencies that Roger was also talking about, that leverage technology for collective and individual aims. Cross-cultural skills development is essential. And so in the longer run, we want to create people that will continue to be mobile mentally and physically. Because indeed, I agree with Roger, mobility is not only physical mobility, it is also a mental process, and you can also be mobile in your mind while sitting at home and working digitally across borders. Next slide, please. So a few examples from SHARE. In the video, you saw actually one of them already. And so we have a Filipino who studied art in Vietnam. At the moment, he's working in the Spanish Ministry of Education in Madrid, mind you, so in the European Union. We have a Malaysian who studied structural engineering in Germany, currently working as a design engineer in Singapore. And again, sharing some recent experiences, with NUFIC, we organized a job fair on the 6th of November, virtually for the whole of Southeast Asia. We had 1,500 registered job seekers, and what we saw is many cross-country applications. So people from Thailand or from Indonesia applying for a job that was available in Vietnam. And that is also what we see and what we continue to see in the shared student mobility workshops that we do, and in the engagement with the almost 600 share alumni that we have. Many examples that their mobility has contributed to their professional development and their employability. And of course, this is still ongoing because share is relatively young. Next slide, please. So some concluding remarks. The first thing is that we do see and continue to see a great interest among young people, the young generation in ASEAN to be mobile and within the region. And I emphasize that because when we started with Share, there was some skepsis. And Miguel, also at the beginning, you started saying, well, if we look at the figures, to the extent that students are mobile and study overseas, they go out of the region. And yes, it is of course true that everyone wants to study in Oxford or in Harvard, but as a matter of fact, that is not what will happen. So regional mobility, Michael Murphy was also referring to it, helps to establish a smaller environmental footprint. It is less expensive, it is more feasible. And I'm really happy to report from Share and our experience that, different from the skepsis at the beginning of our project, we saw hundreds of young people in the ASEAN region apply for a scholarship. And we really need a stringent selection process to come to ultimately awarding the scholarships. So regional mobility can also serve specific regional goals, where ASEAN can help to steer where the region sees most needs in terms of where employment and where the economy needs to be stimulated. So in my view, I think a good chunk of the future of internationalization is regionalization, is making use of the energy and the dynamics of the young generation that is keen to move within the 10 countries of the ASEAN. And yes, Michael, so far only 8 countries participated. That's because Singapore and Brunei are officially not eligible for ODA money that funds the SHARE program. But I have good news for you. We're already working hard on involving Brunei and Singapore universities also in the next phase of SHARE, not the least because some of our mobility will be mobile and will be digital in the coming year. So we definitely hope to include universities from all 10 ASEAN countries in the future of SHARE, contributing to what Roger was mentioning, hopefully an ASEAN branded scholarship program that will carry the region forward in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. First of all, thank you for explaining the last 2 countries. I'm really excited about those developments you mentioned regarding the kind of like ASEAN branded or cross pan-ASEAN scholarships and ideas. And I think it links both to the idea of the community building goals that Roger had mentioned. The other thing I saw a connection with was some of the employment sectors that you mentioned where there might be greater need for thinking about what skills we need to develop regarding sustainable development, sustainable economy areas or industry areas. I think you'd mentioned a couple of them, including care work, which I think is also an interesting area that you mentioned, which well, it might be interesting as well to think about later on with regard to the long-term needs of the region. Thanks. And finally, if we go to our final panelist, Dr. Ramyan Kosaikonod, and I think what would be interesting really now is a kind of perspective from Dr. Ramyan that kind of reflects on on all of what has previously been said, as a more reflective as well as perhaps critical view of all of these initiatives, policies, and schemes in the region. Although we know that Dr. Ramyan's organization itself has been involved through the AIMS, the AIMS program, to promote this mobility. But Dr. Ramyan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Miguel, for the kind introduction and the moderation. So I would like to perhaps start by kind of reshaping the topics. So I changed the topic a little bit to the future world of work, internationalization and graduate employability. So next slide, please. What I'm going to be doing today, I would just covering the 3 points. One, I would be talking or inviting all of us to look into the future world of work. And I'm doing this through various incidents that is happening right now. And the second point would be, exploring the linkages between the internationalization, which I would also like to take Roger's and also Peter's approach to see that internationalization is not just about student mobility. What is internationalization and how it's linked to employability? And last, we'll look into the future. What is the future of the intra-regional mobility? Next, please. So if we are looking into the future world of work, I think we are in the age of transition. I would just show you the incidents that is happening for the past month. It's happening so quickly, and sometimes something has caught us also unprepared. Next slide, please. Within a month, on 28th October 2021, you see the news, all over the place. Facebook has announced that they would introduce the metaverse. So what it means is that the world would change from the desktop to the web and to the phone internet. It has been changed on that direction. In the past, you have the transmission of the text. Now for the web, you can also transfer the photos and videos. And now you move to the phone internet. But then in the future, you would be moving towards the immersive experiences. Yes, some of you may think, oh, this is the stage of investment. But then next slide, please. Last week, Seoul has announced that they are taking on the project called Seoul Metaverse, meaning City Hall project in 2022. They set the objectives that in the future, the Seoul citizen can actually interact or actually do the business with the City Hall without actually turning up in physical, but rather you can send your avatar to actually work, through the metaverse. So actually it's becoming real. Seoul has already announced that. And it's not just Seoul, actually Helsinki also have the similar plan. Next slide, please. Now, if you go into the internet and you search for the metaverse jobs, you'll see the metaversejobs.com, which are advertising all the jobs on the metaverse, including the jobs related to the website for AR, for VR, for NFT, for Web3, for cryptocurrency, for games. And the list in the bullet point I list for you is the name of the companies that advertising for the jobs and the title of the jobs. So you can have like Google, Software Engineer 3, Augmented Reality, or if you want to be a virtual material designer for Nike, or you would want to work for the news agency like Washington Post that is advertising for Meta Inc. reporter, for example. So the metaverse jobs is real, is here, is approaching us, and we are facing that. So if we are talking about internationalization, perhaps we are not talking about the physical only anymore, but we also have to integrate all of this and have bearing this in mind. Next slide, please. Now, you may think, oh, this is kind of scary because everything will go metaverse. In actuality, it's not. If you look at the Pricewaterhouse report that issued in published in 2021, it's actually forecasted that would be 4 worlds of work by 2030. So first two, they color coded. So you have like a red world of work, blue world of work, green world of work, and yellow world of work. What it means by red and blue world of work is the work that's required a lot of high expertise and knowledge on the VR, AR, and also technology and technology advances, skills and knowledge. But for the great world of work, it refers to the world of work that you have lots of innovators, maybe a small innovators doing something very personalized and coming up with solutions for a very personalized pain points. For the blue world of work, on the other hand, is something larger, bigger, done by the big company, big tech company, could be like Facebook or maybe Earth 2, which is another metaverse that trying to sell the land in the virtual reality that is corresponding to the actual land that we have on Earth. So the blue world of work also required another skill sets, which is, high tech, and you have to also know how to do this, and it's go beyond the national control. The green world of work are the people who are working for the companies that is having a bigger purpose of not just doing the job, but they care about the sustainability, they care about social responsibility, they care about the climate change, and so on and so forth. And then the last is the yellow world of work, is the world of work that cares about humans come first. So everything would be handcraft, you value to things that women are doing, care economy that Peter was talking about also included in here. For example, like nursing, how to attend the children, or socialization. So that would be the third kind of skill, another set of skills as well for the yellow world of work. Next slide, please. So, whether you would landing in different kind of worlds of work, you need and you require a skill sets that is necessary. But at present, as the world is changing so quickly and we are being disrupted by so many things, I identified 3 points. One is the COVID-19, second is technology, and third is the climate change and sustainable development goals. For COVID-19, the trend would be we are more cautious about proximity to work. We are more cautious about physical dimension of work. We want to have like a social distancing, prioritize the health issues. And we also wanted to, for the sake of security, want to have a shorter supply chain. Meaning, for example, like China, when they do decoupling, they want to make sure that certain supply is enough for them, sufficient for them, even when they have to have the lockdown again. So it's likely that the activities, the economic activities would be happening, if it is internationalized, would be something very regional. Second is technology. It will change the nature of jobs, and it will also it will change how jobs is also being organized. And as I mentioned, metaverse is something we shouldn't ignore. We should think about it, and what is the advancement of the technology that will have impact on the employability. Third is the climate change, and this has been covered by our various speakers already. Please, next slide, please. Yes, and now I look into the report by LinkedIn, and they were exploring their skills set for 2022. So if you remember in the past, if you have the World Economic Forum, they forecast like skill set for 5 years. And you can see, as they say, the employability, the global employability is changing so quickly because there's so many disruptions. The skill sets required for each year started to change, and the report is coming out for each of the year. And if you can see here, there are various aspects that you have to take into consideration. And the top one is actually resilience and adaptability. This one also, I would like to highlight the discussion about dealing with stress and being more mindful, because a lot of people start to have to work from home and work alone. So they have to like deal with their emotional intelligence, dealing with their own stress, and being more mindful. So adding more human side into it as well. So the skill sets that we required is actually needs to be addressed or rethink again how we are going to integrate that into our internationalization process and activities. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I go to the second point, internationalization and employability. Now I search for the reports that has been published, and I have realized that Erasmus Plus and European Commission has published a series of the higher education impact studies, and I picked up the 2019, and they said that there are clear linkages between internationalization and employability. And students are very highly satisfied with the program because of the perceived impact on the personal development and employability. So there's a clear linkages. But even so, there are differentiated impact. For example, if the student join on the first cycle of mobility, they would have a larger and longer impact on them. If they are coming from the poorer or relatively lower GDP countries or coming from Southern Europe, their perceived impact seems to be lasting longer and larger as well. Next slide, please. But then very unfortunate, like in Southeast Asia, there is a data gap and there is a lack of direct impact study on employability. I realize that EU Share is trying to do it right now, and Miguel is helping to support that. But there was also the study, one before that Darren has been involved with, but it's not directly about the employability. Next slide, please. I would like to just to share with you how the employability is situated in the work of Samuel Whitehead and internationalization. So if you understand, or if you see the picture of Samuel Whitehead, that we are working as a regional organization and working on the policy with our counterparts who are mostly governments, then you will realize that actually when we are studying the aims of Asian International Mobility programs for students, it was started as a pilot project of the 3 countries. During that time, it was long before the ASEAN community in 2015. AIMS was actually established in 2009. And when we are doing that, we are trying to create a platform where the universities and also the government learn about the harmonization of this region. So employability has been embedded in that. It has been seen as a cross-cutting issue and is integrated in the elements of the work that we do at Samuel Whitehead. However, with our priorities, we believe that with the leadership, teaching and learning, and research and internationalization of higher education is the place where the employability is situated. So the aims, although we have tried to pursue introduce the idea that maybe we can do internship as the mobility, it was not yet very successful. So I end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramyan. And clearly, with regard to the evolution of the world of work, we've heard from the need in the care sector all the way to the metaverse. So I think we have a lot of scope for new kinds of work, new kinds of employment opportunities, as well as new kinds of skills that are required. Can we begin now with a general question, I guess, for everyone, which is with regard to that point about different sectors and different needs of the region, and maybe a brief comment from each one regarding what sectors would you think would be more would demand more graduates with ASEAN mobility. So are there sectors that need these skills or these kinds of graduates more than others? And perhaps because this is a policy dialogue, what do you think should the role of the employers in these sectors be? How can we as our communities, policy communities, the education community, engage in a partnership with employers? Well, we just, because in the interests of time, apart from that question, we do have some questions from the audience, perhaps that we can ask now together so that you can give your responses together. I don't know if our colleagues or administrators would like to. Yes, there is that question for Roger regarding mutual recognition arrangements. And I think there was also another question from if we see another one. Yes, there's another question regarding how can we engage the ASEAN curriculum or benchmark quality standards for graduate mobility. So I guess it's about the role of curriculum development, and this might speak to Dr. Choltis's earlier point about what changes are required in pedagogy. So there's, I guess, harmonization, which Roger might want to speak about, and then changes in pedagogy and curriculum quality that might also need to be discussed, apart from the bigger question, as I said, about new sectors for employment and engaging with employers. So over to anyone who would like to start. Maybe we can go through reverse order now. Start perhaps with Ramyan for some comments, and then move backwards to Peter, then to Roger, and then to Choltis. And then maybe after that, we'll have a round of closing statements.
Yes, thank you very much, Miguel. And actually, I skipped one PowerPoint slide, which is very important. It's the future oriented of intra-regional mobility, and I would like to touch upon that a little bit, and I will address your question definitely. What I see as the future of the intra-regional mobility, I think it's time, if we are considering this future of work. We have to rethink about the values of the international mobility or internationalization activities that we are having in this region. And with that values, we realize that actually the international mobility of students is not really gearing towards only employability. And what we means is that we have to think about something bigger, which Peter also addressed, something about the sustainability, think about the footprint, how we actually doing things. Of course, with the employability, and we will not be able to catch up with the metaverse. It takes us a long time to really understand them. So we have to have that engagement as well. So which would means that even during the designing of the mobility programs, we also have to think about various modes and making sure that the student get to practice how to actually work, if they have to go and work in that environment really, or co-create or collaborate or work in teams, in the metaverse. We also have to think about, even though there is a metaverse, there is also the reality of the world in our region. We have our own issues, we have our own problems. We also need to have a care taken care of. So with that, I think we need to have the engagement of stakeholders, not just the employers, but also, employers in the sense that not just in the real world, but in the metaverse, but also the people who are the local stakeholders, whom, the graduates that we actually produce or cultivated would actually be able to live in the world. Now, impact studies, which is the problems of this region, is still a problem. But then because of the skill sets that we require is changing so fast, what we have to do with the impact tracer is something that we have to really sit down and think about what kind of thing we wanted to groom and how to actually move forward. Now, you ask about the sectors of the employment. I would say, actually, the region, if we understand the region very, very well, we have the country that is very advanced in everything, even technology or in terms of higher education development. But then you also have the sector, have the countries that is less developed. So in this case, then what it means, and if you put into the framework of different world of works in the color, you would see that they are located, or maybe they require people who work or suitable workforce who are coming from various countries. So if you see the region as a whole, and I do agree with Peter that actually food security, something like that, is very crucial for this region. And we are very good with the care economy. So it's something that we can think of or look into it. Plus, with the care, in the past, it used to be in the disproportionate burden on women. So we can think about how technology can help us to lighten the burden of the women. Thank you. Sorry, taking a long time.
No, not at all. All very important ideas, Dr. Ramyan. Can we move to Peter?
Thank you very much, Miguel. And I feel like responding to 1,000 things now, but let me not do that. Let me continue on the issue of sustainable food production that I mentioned in my presentation, and the agriculture sector, also because Ibu Ramyan just referred to it. And I guess it's probably also because I'm most familiar with the sector. If you ask, how international or how regionalized is the sector, if you look at it from the business point of view, the corporate sector looks at ASEAN as one region and operates within it as one region. Where do we produce something? Where do we sell something? What about the logistics, the marketing? they look at, the chambers of commerce, etc. They operate regionally. We see that also in the job fair I was referring to in my presentation. We did it with a number of companies that operate across the region. They recruit regionally, really. They look for the best person, and whether that person comes from Vietnam or from Thailand or from Malaysia, that is a secondary issue to them. So I think where the mileage is to be gained in terms of cooperation is on the other side, on the government side, on ASEAN side. I think Roger was already pointing in a number of directions. More collaborations between universities. That's where, of course, also the role of AUN and others come into the picture. I think we can do a lot more in promoting collaboration at the level of lecturers. That also responds to the question on, how do you build a curriculum? A curriculum is not a top-down issue. It's not something that the government prescribes in one thing. Lecturers need to sit down together, indeed, with companies and say, okay, what is useful? What do students need to learn? And in agriculture, that's a very concrete thing. And I've seen that happening in a number of universities. So start from the bottom up, but create more opportunities. And to some extent, we are doing that in SHARE right now, because we are creating more opportunities also for collective online international learning. So we work more on the side of the universities and the lecturers. I think that's where a lot of progress can still be made. In the longer run, that would be my dream scenario, is I would really hope that ASEAN would be able to also start supporting larger research programs in the region. And one of the big successes in the European Union is the Horizon 2020 program that forces educational institutions from across the EU to work together, and actually increasingly also so beyond the EU only. I think that is a fantastic way to create that added value that we need and the platforms that we need to take on the challenges of our time. That would be, in the longer run, be, I think, my dream scenario, if ASEAN could, not only have an ASEAN branded scholarship, but have an ASEAN branded research program. But that's, of course, I understand will still take time. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Peter. Hopefully Roger can tell us when exactly ASEAN will have that ASEAN Research Council funds, among other answers you might have. Roger, I think your microphone is still muted.
Okay. I'm not going to answer that question. Okay. After Dr. Ramyan and Peter saying, there's a lot of things I can't say, but then let me add something. In terms of which particular segments, I do agree with Dr. Ramyan. There is space for everywhere, except that the sectors cannot accommodate everyone. Some people will have to stay in their locality, in their countries, in the region. And there's also different sectors which are developed in different aspects. Okay. Now, the core issue is that at the regional level, policy directions are pointing towards promoting and strengthening the digital economy. In fact, I was looking at one of my PowerPoint slides for another talk, talking about the ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025, which talks about digital transformation of traditional sectors and fair competitive digital market and inclusive, sustainable, accessible digital ecosystem, which basically tells us that even the traditional sectors are not left behind. They will be transformed to a certain extent, that they will be supported and to a certain extent transformed in terms of delivery, in terms of access to the populace. So there's a transformation of the traditional sectors. Of course, there are new sectors, the care economy, the health economy, green economy, blue economy, and so much. There might be, Dr. Ramyan was talking about the multiverse. There might be a virtual economy and something happening, but it's too early to say now. I mean, I'm not at liberty to say how it will develop. I mean, we never know. There are opportunities and challenges in everything. The important thing there is to take charge and develop oneself to ensure that we actually move forward, that we're capable of addressing the opportunities, getting the required skills and opportunities. Okay, that's one aspect. The other questions, oh my God, I can talk about that for hours. Now, MRAs, mutual recognition agreements in ASEAN, has been existing. I think they've been signed as early as 2005. I think there's 7 major professions and 1 framework, mutual agreement framework. That includes architecture, engineering, nursing, medicine, dentistry, accountancy, tourism professionals. Yeah, I'm not going to name everything, but the thing there is mutual recognition agreements is actually good because there is a verbal agreement between ASEAN member states to work towards recognizing professional qualifications of other ASEAN member states. The problem there is the implementation. As far as I know, the ASEAN architect and ASEAN engineering are doing very well. There's a register, there is a set of qualifications for a licensed architect or engineer in an ASEAN member states have to show before they can register and be declared an ASEAN architect or engineer. The tourism profession also has something similar, and they're moving forward significantly well. That's one aspect. Now, related to that is the notion of an ASEAN curriculum. The skills and competencies required for each profession differs within each ASEAN member state. Okay. At the same time, the license to participate and be engaged in the profession is under the regulation of ASEAN member states or even delegated through agencies, be it in the public or private sector. That's one aspect. Now, having an ASEAN curriculum does not necessarily mean that you'll be accepted. It just ensures to a certain extent, take note, to a certain extent, that graduates of these programs, which are supposed to have a basis on ASEAN regulations, which we would call ASEAN curriculum, that their graduates would actually meet the skills and competencies required for the ASEAN region. But then there's a lot of work to be done. I forgot which particular policy, but there's something in terms of aligning and harmonizing qualifications, mostly in the professional skill sector. No, that's it. I hope I answered it.
Thank you so much, Roger. We've really pushed to the limits of what we can do with this panel. So we have about 1 or 2 minutes left. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Choltis. And perhaps at the end of your remarks, you can give us one very concrete idea or recommendation, apart from commenting on the rest, on what can we do to improve these mobility programs.
Right, Miguel, in 1 minute. The question on the quality standards asked by our friends and colleague from Cambodia, I think it's answered already by Roger. And my final remark is that I think what Peter said about the dream scenario, I think is coming sooner rather than later. For example, we are under the AUN, we are doing the cooperation with under the EU support project on what Roger just said, a professional standards. We were doing under the tuning academy, how to assess the standards of a very specific subject matter, 3 areas: teacher education, civil engineering, and medicine. And doing exactly what Peter said is a bottom up. We gather our lecturers coming together to build this up so that we can have a kind of comparison between the ASEAN standards and the European one. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you so much, Roger. Any one line about what we can improve? One concrete idea?
2 lines. Never say no because you don't understand what's out there. Reach out for the stars and you don't know what heights you can reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Peter?
I mentioned it. I think the most immediate thing we can do is also encourage more mobility between teachers, professors across ASEAN to go hand in hand with student mobility. And let's focus on the students that wants to be mobile because they will be the change.
Thank you so much, Peter. And finally, Dr. Ramyan?
Thank you. So I think I would still encourage the internationalization and mobility, but the design needs to be something more inclusive, more flexible, explore various modes of mobilities. And on the planning, we need to get the engagement of the stakeholders, employers are included, and assessment is a key. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our panelists as well as to our audience. There was a lot of engagement. I'm afraid we didn't have time to go through all the questions, but I hope that you found this panel very, very useful and that you could engage with us in other parts of this forum or via perhaps direct contact with the panelists. Thank you so much to Darren and to our colleagues supporting the panel technically and in a wider way through EU Share. Thank you very much, everyone.
After the exchange is the connection between the shared alumni. The friendship is precious. They constantly inspire me in my life. Volunteering is part of my career. Currently, I'm connecting the volunteers in our region to help a rural community school in Cambodia that I used to volunteer there. So giving back makes my career more meaningful. Shared mobility experience motivates me to pursue my studies internationally and contribute to the society regionally. I wish to pursue my studies in a foreign country and bring experience home. Go global, stay local. Share impacts me as a person in terms of confidence. I speak out more now. So I also believe in myself and the world that we are going to get better.
about shares the impact on my professional horizons, it's really enriching in the sense that I've had the opportunity to meet friends who now seem to be leaders in their own fields. I'm very proud of them. And also the opportunity to meet high-profile people in different sectors, to the regional events held by Shen. I'd say having international experiences is a really big plus in my job search and probably everyone's. Our applications are generally favored somehow because of our exposure to different cultures and peoples. I'm currently teaching courses related to language and culture at my university, and I think that quite evidently reflects She's impact on my career choice. Now I'm working in Vietnam, but just a couple of years back, I was working in the Kingdom of Thailand. I'd say that She somehow contributes to the formation of identity, which goes beyond and above national boundaries. I have learned not only to appreciate other cultures, but at the same time learn to reflect on my own culture and my own identity as a person. And my worldview is therefore tremendously broadened, and I really appreciate that.
This exchange program made me feel like I am a part of the Asian community by seeing people come together unitedly as one and able to go past the language barrier and communicate with each other using one language, English. This shows that we all Asian countries work together to become one. The most memorable thing after my exchange is water festival in Mandalay University, and the food is very delicious and people very friendly, and the culture is very fascinating, and I really love Bagan. The major skill I acquired from this mobility is communication skill. It helped me to connect with other people easier and appreciate different culture and respect each other's diverse view. During Share Mobility program, I joined Islamic community trip as well as many other trips with my Burmese, Korean, Indonesian and American friends from different states, villages and culture, which inspired me to work with a diversity of people from different background and culture, which I am doing today as a community outreach manager in an international IT company with a diverse employee and a work environment. that I found most memorable from Indonesia was that I saw a lot of similarities as well as differences with the Philippines, and this really helped me define what being Filipino was. My shared scholarship experience expanded my professional horizons by letting me meet multiple people such as students and professors who were well versed in my field, as well as I got to meet different types of organizations due to the different opportunities that SHARE presented. My first speaking experience was in Indonesia, and it allowed me to gain the skill sets that I need to actually become a speaker during seminars, and I've also talked about different aspects as well as food accessibility and food malnutrition, which was heavily influenced by the fishing community that I was able to visit in Indonesia because of a friend. My exchange contributed to feeling or being a part of the ASEAN community by letting me gain friends from these countries, as well as exposing myself to the ASEAN Secretariat and also making me realize about the differences and the similarities of our cultures and languages.
And thank you for rejoining us. We hope you found the last panel discussion very interesting and beneficial. I certainly did. Never enough time, as we know. We'd now like to go into the presentation of the first of 3 studies being finalized by SHARE expert consultants. And today we're looking at the State of Play study on internationalization in ASEAN, which has been conducted by Associate Professor Dr. Pornapit Darasawang and Dr. Robert Wagoner. Dr. Darasawang is Vice President for Internationalization at King Mongkut's University of Technology, Thonburi in Thailand. She obtained her PhD in teaching English for speakers of other languages from the University of Edinburgh. And as a Vice President for Internationalization, one of her major goals is to develop KMUTT's students' intercultural competence and English language proficiency. She has a great interest in internationalization at home, and she provides a platform for this for international students who study at KMUTT. So many thanks for joining us, Dr. Darasawang. And now to Dr. Robert Wagoner, who's a professor of history and politics of higher education and director of the International Tuning Academy at the University of Groningen. His research interest is in higher education innovation and policymaking. He's been involved in many international initiatives, such as the development of the European Credit Transfer System since 1989, and 2 overarching European qualifications frameworks. He's been involved in many EU capacity building projects around the world, and at present he coordinates the project Measuring and Comparing Achievements of Learning Outcomes in Higher Education in Asia, 2021 to 2023, and this has a focus on ASEAN. So I'll be your moderator for this session, and I'm very pleased to say that we'll have members of the SHARE Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice joining us for the Q&A session. So I'd also like to invite you to submit your questions to our experts in the chat. So let's get started and learn more about this interesting study. So over to you, Dr. Darasawang and Dr. Wagoner. Thank you.
Okay, I will take the start, and then Pornapit takes over. So the next slide, please. So we conducted this study during the last 4 months, more or less, making a distinction between desk research, obtaining a general review of the situation at the moment according to the literature. Of course, we had the issue that we had COVID-19, which was not really reflected, of course, in the literature yet. We also constructed a database to find out which universities to approach with regard to a questionnaire, which resulted in a survey, which was indeed sent to 400 higher education institutions, and we got 110 respondents. And we had tailored interviews with the people who are informed about the situation, but also with experts from the higher education institutions. Next slide, please. So I give over to Purnapit, who will go over the outcomes of the survey, and then I will come back.
Okay, yes. So this is the profile of the universities that we chose to be involved in the study. So you can see that we are trying to involve as many as 5% of the university in each country. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay, this is a little bit small, but I would like to show to you that even though we have only 27.5% of the participants, but we can have all the countries in the ASEAN region to participate in this study. Next, please. Okay. This is the profile of the institutions which are involved in this survey, and you can see that we can cover many types of universities and also the focus and also the size. Next, please. The first thing that we would like to know is about the internationalization as perceived in institutional priority. So we asked about their strategic plan, and most of them mentioned that their strategic plan, internationalization is their strategic plan, and they monitor their strategic plan internally, and they also have a special unit to set it up in order to monitor it. Next, please. Because we are interested whether COVID-19 has an effect on internationalization or not, so we asked about the perception of importance of internationalization 2 years before COVID-19 and during the COVID-19. And we found out that the perception of the interest, of the importance of internationalization increased a lot during that time. The effect of COVID-19 on strategy is not that much, because only 8.18% stated that the strategic plan is obsolete, whereas the other things that obsolete only to a minor extent and still relevant. Next, please. This is the internationalization actors. There are many parties who are involved in internationalization activities, but the main actor is the International Office. Next, please. So we asked whether there is any training given to facilitate the implementation of internationalization strategy or not. And they say that to the administrative staff and also to some of the faculties or school. Next, please. So we are also interested to see the internationalization activities that have been given priority over the past 4 years. And student exchange is the activity that they reported the most. And then they also talk about research collaboration, mobility, both staff mobility and student mobility. Next, please. So for student mobility, a lot of the participants stated that they have both inbounds and outbounds. Next, please. So we want to know more about the details of inbound and outbound, and we found out that the outbound student is a little bit higher than the inbound student mobility. Next, please. So we want to see whether they have full-time foreign students or not. And many of them, I mean, around 34% say that they have around less than 1%, and 34% stated that they have around 1% to 5%. But still, there are 8% who stated that the full-time foreign student is 5 to 10%. Next, please. For staff mobility, many of them stated they have both inbound and outbound. Next, please. And same as student mobility, that they have more outbound staff mobility than the inbound staff mobility, but just a little bit more. Next, please. So as Robert said, that we are interested whether COVID-19 has an effect on internationalization or not. So we want to see whether internationalization cooperation activities can continue during the COVID-19 or not. And many say that research collaboration and participation in international projects are the two main activities that go on during the COVID-19. But they also stated that online teaching to an international audience is also popular. Next, please. So we want to see the main geographical focus for their internationalization activities. Many of them stated that there is no differentiation between ASEAN countries and non-ASEAN countries, whereas 16% stated that they focus on ASEAN country. Next, please. For harmonization of higher education, we want to see what tools that they think important for harmonization. And many of them stated that ASEAN standards and guidelines for quality assurance is the most important tool, and followed by a common credit system. Next, please. So we want to see whether the tools that they said that it is important, do they use that in their institution or not? So many of them stated that national qualifications framework is used in their institution, followed by a credit system based on contact hours. Next, please. So the last question is on barriers to internationalization. And many of them stated that insufficient financial resources is the main barrier to internationalization. Lack of recognition mechanism is also stated. And they also talk about limited faculty involvement or interest in doing internationalization activities. So this is the evidence from the survey. Then Robert is going to tell you about the summary, which we include the interview from the focus group as well. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Robert.
Okay, thank you, Pornapit. So we had interesting interviews with focus interviews, but also in a number of individual interviews, because people were not available for a focus interview. But it gave us a lot of additional information. So what we see, of course, is that we are dealing with a very complex situation at the moment. And with regard to internationalization, if you talk about internationalization, you also talk about modernization of higher education. And you have to take into account, of course, what's happening around the world. So we have today globalization, of course, but of course already for a longer time. Climate change concerns are playing a role, and we are expected to do something with this within the context of higher education. And of course, also digitalization. So all these elements have an effect on the way you organize your programs, where modernization and internationalization actually meet. So what we see in the what we see is high awareness from the interviews we had, high awareness in the Asian region among key stakeholders about pre-agreed policies, declarations, and work plans. A lot of work has been done during the last particular 10 years, but also the last 5 years. And they meet indeed those challenges which we have discussed. Next slide. So of course, there are conditions for success. What is very clear, and also we noticed this, is that stakeholders must have clear commitment, show commitment to the agenda that has been set. Whether this is a strategic partnership or a strategic plan for the institution, there is the need of commitment. But of course, commitment has different levels. Of course, we have the Ministers of Education that has to stimulate and facilitate the process of internationalization. Governments have to take their responsibilities and steer their higher education institutions. But of course, also the higher education institutions have their role to play. So we are talking about modernization, but we're also talking about the enhancing the quality of higher education. Next slide, please. Next slide. So with regard to mobility, what we can see is that the mobility has been rather successful. We have seen a grow over the last particular 5 years. We have seen a grow of student mobility outbound and inbound in the ASEAN region. So what we can see that all the investment is paying off. Of course, there is room for improvement, but tremendous steps have been made. Mobility, by definition, is related to the recognition of studies, and that's why it's so important to see that the instruments that have been developed are actually used and should be used more by these institutions, but also by others which are in initial stages of going international. But of course, trust doesn't go automatically. Trust comes with evidencing, so you have to show that you're a reliable partner, and that's why these tools are so important. To assure that we can trust, of course, not only the national system, but also the higher education institutions. Because you are giving your diploma, you take over part of the studies that have been done elsewhere that have to be included in your program, and you give the degree. So you must be sure that certain standards are indeed met. Next slide. So internationalization is also staff mobility, as we have noticed. It's capacity building, both in education and research. This, of course, is global. It's not limited to the Asian region. But of course, it's very important that the Asian regions works together, but also, of course, with the outside world, whether this is the +3 or with other countries in the world. But we also have to be fair that the cooperation between academic supporting staff is still limited. There is indeed room for further improvement. And of course, this restricts by definition the effectiveness of educational systems and their institutions. If you have a wider circle, you have more effect. What we also notice, of course, and that's not new for you, that outbound mobility still takes place to a very large extent to Western countries, or Japan and Korea. And that, of course, has to be taken into account. How interesting is the ASEAN region as a place to study? And in all the interviews, but also in the survey, it came out that in the perception of people, ASEAN still deals with an image problem, which is a problem which is well known to me because we had the same in Europe with regard to Eastern Europe at the beginning when Eastern Europe joined Europe, but that has overcome. So there's now much more trust, and people really believe that what's happening in the eastern part of Europe is also of good quality, but it took time to get used to each other. And this is probably also the case partly in Asian. People really have to believe in the Asian agenda. And of course, there is the issue of language, not for all countries, but for some, of course, in the region, which limits the cooperation within ASEAN. Next slide. What is still an issue is that ASEAN deals with different credit systems at the level of institutions within countries, but also we have at least three credit systems in the Asian setting. And that is normally not helpful. It's better to have one shared system which is understood by all. Because it frustrates, as you have seen also in other regions. ASEAN is not unique here. We have the same challenges in Central Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, and we have overcome it largely in Europe because of ECTS, but that took a long time. And we started ECTS developing in 1989, and we are now in 2021, and we have still some challenges. So it shows that change in higher education takes time. There is actually no real alternative for having a coherent transfer system, and actually also an accumulation system, because course-to-course recognition only works in partnerships. In partnerships, it might work well because you trust each other, but if you widen the circle, if you open up, of course, it's not a reliable instrument anymore. So this issue has to be studied further, and solutions have to be found here, and we can learn from other world regions. Next slide, please. What we can see as regard of the pandemic, and that didn't really came as a surprise, but was much more positive than we expected, is that online learning has really been boosted. There's much more cooperation than there was before. More higher education institutions are discussing ways to internationalize their curricula, and students actually also make use of this. And this cooperation, online cooperation, is a step forward with regard to internationalization. It's to a certain extent an alternative for internationalization at home, because that focuses in particular what happens within an institution. But if you link those two, you have a powerful instrument. Internationalization at home, although Pornopit might be an expert, is still limited in its effect in the region. It's more popular, it seems to be, at the moment in Europe and the United States or Northern America. Next slide, please. So what is very strongly developed, and what is also very, very important, and we found this out in the interviews, that partnerships are crucial. But at the same time, internationalization is still limited to too few institutions. This is a very large region with many, many institutions, most institutions in any region in the world. So we have to take this into account. In particular, of course, based in two countries because of its geographical structure, the Philippines and Indonesia. But there are still steps to make for many institutions. And we have to find strategies, or you have to find strategies for organizing this more effectively. Internationalization in a number of countries is linked to ranking, budget allocation, and that favors a limited number, but it might be useful to widen this circle. And there are ways of doing this. So policy of favoring limits the possibilities, of course, of other institutions to develop an international profile. So also more forms of internationalization should be embraced. But this, of course, requires, again, an infrastructure to make educational systems more comprehensible and compatible. Next slide, please. So our advice is with regard to ASEAN and individual governments to be more ambitious in promoting the Asian region, because you have a lot to sell. Showcase the attractiveness of the region, country, towns, and higher education institutions, not only within, of course, the ASEAN region, but also to the global world. Disseminate with conviction the instruments that have been developed to harmonize higher education, because when people can see that these instruments are in place, the trust you are building as a result, of course, is a very positive one, and will affect the image. And I have dare to say, having worked in this field, that the instruments are really current, they are high level. So that should be showcased to the rest of the world as well. And indeed support initiatives to develop a common lifelong learning credit transfer and accumulation system. What we learned in Europe is that only transfer probably is too limited, because when you transfer, you also accumulate credits. So you have to make clear in your own programs what actually should be recognized. So you need a foundation to be able to transfer credits. So either you have a shared system, or you have different systems, but then they have to be very transparent and they have to be very clear. Else there is nothing to transfer. What is an issue within the Asian region, but also globally, that there's not too much focus on student workload, and student workload makes a difference. Besides also learning outcomes, of course, that have to be defined, but they go closely together. You must be sure that the workload is indeed comparable. So some research should be done here, and this actually we also learn from other parts in the world. Next one. So with regard to individual countries and governments, we suggest to support the activities of the Asian Working Group on Higher Education Mobility, because to align efforts, of course, is better to do it separately. And we also suggest to create, and that's not unique because others have proposed this, although we might go one step further, create a regional endowment fund to stimulate for intra-Asian cooperation, covering scholarships for students, staff, but also for joint research. Showcase that Asian indeed is a region, but also give the instruments. And solve indeed practical issues, aligning timetables, has been very important in Europe and other parts of the world, and also in Asia, of course. Organize visa procedures more tailored. Proposals have been done, but they still have to be implemented, both for academic staff and students. At the moment, there's no differentiation between inter-Asian procedures and outer-Asian procedures. The ministers have proposed to solve this issue, and action, of course, is required here. And it also makes it much more active and much more, how to say this, attractive to study within the intra-Asian context. So it will facilitate Asian intra-mobility better. Next one. So ensure better marketing. So maybe you can organize even more summer schools, intensive programs, and teacher courses, although this is already taking place. Apply the model of networks and partnerships more effectively. Maybe it's a suggestion that you combine efforts of institutions, group institutions, to work together, also to limit the costs and to showcase together to the outside world what you represent. Connect these circles of institutions, for example, 5, to other circles in the Asian region, and create more thematic networks, disciplinary networks, and communities for cooperation between institutions. It can be done face-to-face, but it can also be done online, of course. But trust building, of course, is quite important here, as we have learned also in other regions, and it's no different for ASEAN. If people trust each other, you get a real change. And I learned this by heart when we developed ECTS. At the beginning, nobody trusted anybody, but after meeting each other, after having intense discussions together, we got a completely different atmosphere, and trust was indeed built between people from different countries. And let's face it, engineers love engineers, and historians love historians, and business people love business people. So these communities, of course, can be developed in such a way that they are very effective. Next one. Thank you for your attention. Also on behalf of Pornabit.
Many thanks to you both, and I like that last point. I think higher education professionals also love higher education professionals, and academics love academics. So that is very much in the context of us developing our community of practice. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce 3 members of our newly established SHARE Higher Education Harmonization Community of Practice. So first of all, we have Dr. Tatum, who is the Faculty and Academic Development Specialist at BINUS University, Jakarta, and a faculty member of the BINUS Business School International Undergraduate Program. So very welcome to you, Dr. Tatum. Next, we have Dr. Susanto, Manager of the International Office of Universitas Bandar Lampung. And also, we are joined by Ms. Sukalin, who is the Director of the Global Academic Affairs Division at the Office of the International Affairs and Global Network at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. So we have colleagues from around the region, and they have plenty of questions, I think, for Robert and Pornabit. Before we get to the questions, perhaps we could ask Dr. Tatum to introduce herself and mention her role in the SHARE community of practice as well.
Hello, good afternoon from Indonesia, from Jakarta. My name is Tatum, as already mentioned by Darren. I joined the community starting from the workshop for the COIL and Virtual Exchange program, and I'm very happy to be inside this community.
Ms. Sukalin, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
From Bangkok, Thailand. I'm Sukalin Wanakasimsan, the Director of Global Academic Affairs, Chulalongkorn University. I first joined the share community from many workshops, like as Tatu mentioned, I also joined the COI program and also Credential and many more. And I also joined the share interview of this session last September. Nice to be here.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm sure you have very precise questions then in that case. And Dr. Susanto, please. Sorry, Dr. Susanto, you're on mute. You just need to unmute your microphone at the bottom.
Yeah.
There we
okay.
go.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, hi. I'm Dr. Susanto from University Bandar Lampung, the manager of International Office here. And nice to meet you all. I have been involved in this community recently, and then it is a very great honor for me to join this shared session, especially for policy dialogue setting. Yeah. Thank you, Darren. Yes.
Excellent. So just to say that I'd like to have another discussion with our community of practice members and our two experts, but I'd also encourage our attendees online to put their questions in the chat, and we will come to those very soon also. So we have just over 20 minutes, and allow me to mention that our experts have very kindly agreed to join a networking session that will take place after this, where the wider community can put their questions to them about the studies. So let's carry on. And I think let's take the first question. I think that's from Dr. Tatum.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. I find it very interesting in your study that you have pointed in the study that internationalization in ASEAN in terms of joint degree still has more branches of foreign university in ASEAN. So in your study, do you encounter whether there is an interest to have validating partners from intra-ASEAN institutions? And what can be done to increase students' trust to the quality of education of intra-ASEAN partners?
Who pointed it?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Especially between Indonesia and Malaysia. So we found out that actually there are intra-region partnership like this, but there are many universities who express that they would like to upgrade their upgrade their standard of education by pairing with the university in Europe or in Australia or in the US. Yeah. So when you ask me whether there is an interest or not, yes, there is. And whether there is, in order to gain trust, I think, as Robert just said, that knowing each other is very important. So being in the same cluster or being in the same network is also raising trust. Because I remember I talked to Sukalin who say that even though I don't use anything, I remember she said so. Even though I don't use any tool that you mentioned, but we know we can trust with each other by knowing each other's work from being in the same network. Yeah. So the network is very helpful, I think.
Okay.
Robert,
yeah, maybe in addition, what I learned, I'm very long already in this business, and not only for Europe but also in other parts of the world. The moment you showcase that you have organized your studies well and show the quality, let's say, by, for example, in your study guides, what is on offer, that you have clear aims with regard to your programs, but also to your individual units. If people get a transparent idea of what is on offer, of course, you make yourself very attractive. And this is often an issue for many institutions, that they don't showcase their offer sufficiently well to the outside world. They offer it to the inside world if you are in that institution, but not to the outside. And that's why, for example, what Share has now done with regard to the credit transfer system, they ask you to showcase your offers. And that will really help you to become interesting for not only partners within the ASEAN region, but also outside the ASEAN region. But let's say first the intra-ASEAN region. If as a student you think, okay, this is what I'm looking for, this is a reason to come over. Of course, you have a winner.
Okay. but is it also a question about ranking that will influence that decision to partnering and to partnerships and having validating partners from non-ASEAN region compared to institution inside the region? Is it a substantial factor in deciding for the partnering?
I think so, right, Robert? Yeah, I think from our impression, yeah. Uh-huh.
No, it is. It seems to be a particular, to be very open here, it seems to be more an issue in your region than, for example, in other regions. So this looking to rankings. Rankings are not so important in Europe. We developed in Europe our own ranking system, which focus much more on content and the profiles than on prestige. And you have to be very careful with rankings because it focuses on a limited number of disciplines. It doesn't showcase fields in which you can be very good, but they don't show off in a ranking. So I think it's overvalued, to be honest. Ranking, at least that is my perception from Europe, and that's why we have a tendency. We also say this in our report: don't take it too seriously, because it has clear limitations.
I think we often find the rankings mean a lot when we're top of the rankings, but not so much when we're not. But there is definitely questions about metrics and methodologies. I'd like to go to Sukalin, please, now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Pornapit and Robert, to do this study. I really like the outcome of this research. Especially raising awareness of internationalization is a multi-level and multifaceted process. It's not only the Office of International Affairs to take care of that, but everyone in the institution must be involved. So what would be like the best approach or suggestion that higher education could do to meet this ideal internationalization at home?
To me, okay, part of it is that I think it's the commitment of the government. If you think that you cannot, not all the students can afford. If you think that if you want to have international experience, you have to go out. If not all the students can afford that, that means that you have to raise or you have to make the to create the environment where internationalization at home is can replace the real experience of going abroad. So to me, I think it involves a lot of things: financial resources, commitment, and also the change of attitudes as well. If you change attitudes and show to the students that internationalization at home also have values in trying to give students international experience. And what it means by international experience, because we want to encourage them to be global citizen. So we have to look at the last outcome, what it means by doing this. And then in this way, I think we can kind of increase internationalization at home. Let other people have the value in what it is. Yeah, this is my perception, but I don't know whether others would have the same idea or not.
No, I think you're completely right with the multi-level. Of course, there are different responsibilities, but the first step could be within an institution, for example, to have a deep discussion about the effects of what's happening in the world, around the world, and how it affects your programs. These are international developments, and which you can, of course, cooperate internationally with colleagues, whether this is our international offices or these are academics. But you can also change, of course, and that's why we think that internationalization and modernization is so closely connected. You can also internationalize your programs, take into account that we have to find solutions together for the challenges of tomorrow, whether this is climate change, whether this is globalization, whether this is a more tailored education with regard to the needs of society, that people have to be educated to be successful in society. We still have worldwide the tendency to look mostly inside. So we are, as an academic, we transfer knowledge, but actually we should debate knowledge. We have to make people skilled besides making them knowledgeable. And this requires, of course, a different type of institutions in which this international dimension plays an important role, in which you can, of course, also lean to others, but also ask help from others. And the online model seems to be ideal. So that you invite somebody who gives you an expert in the field, gives you a perfect online explanation of a number of issues which you don't have the expertise for, but it's now available, and students really discovered it. Colleagues discovered it. So although COVID had very negative points, it also has some positive points that we are more aligned now throughout the world, and we realize that there are other strategies and means to set this agenda also at a multi-dimensional, multifaceted level.
Thank you, Robert. If I could just stay with the topic of internationalization at home, because I'd like to bring in Dr. Susanto, who has a question on this.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, my questions. Yeah, as discussed in your studies, that higher education institutions are discussing ways of international curricula as the effect of pandemic COVID. I believe that it is very nice for all of us here to know that situation. According to you, what are the potential strategies for internationalization? The curricula can be conducted by higher education institution in Asian region, especially for creating and developing learning outcomes related to global international competencies into their graduate profiles.
Do you mean how to increase it? How to increase the connection like this?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, what we found out from the study is that in order to have the joint degree, there are three types of joint degree. One is that they do it with the Western countries. The second one is that they do it with ASEAN with Korea or Japan or Taiwan or China as well. And then the last one is that they do it in intra-region. So when you asked, I think I myself think that whenever you are trying to develop joint degree or double degree, we are trying to upgrade our curriculum because we have outsider to come into the program and look at it. And then whenever we have other people who scrutinize our program, to me, I think it's good in that way, because you have different perspective and things like that. So when you ask whether we can do it, I'm not sure whether I got the question correctly or not, whether we can do it within the intra-region or not. It started already. And I think that it is one of the popular activities when you are among the people who have the same interest. Like if you are within this network, and then you may start with something like mobility, and then later on, when you find the right partner, you are trying to do this kind of thing. I mean, this activity, which is joint degree, double degree. So I don't know whether I answer your question or not, but this is I see the development of the university in this region this way.
Yeah,
with regard to trying to offer joint degree, double degree, which is kind of internationalizing curriculum. Robert, would you like to?
Yeah. I'm really a fan of joint degrees, to be honest. I'm running one myself with 8 partners from Europe, but 4 from outside Europe. But you brought up learning outcomes. Of course, you have to find a shared platform. So you have to define your learning outcomes for a joint degree. And that already is fun, to work with colleagues from other intra-Asian countries and academics, but also internationalization experts, to find common ground, to define the learning outcomes for a particular joint program, and to discover that you can pool resources, that you have a larger group of people who actually can offer a program which is tailored to the region, but also take into account the needs of the country. So it brings you a lot of elements extra, but also it brings you in, of course, different students from different countries, and so this multicultural dimension, developing a respect for each other, etc., is quite crucial. It's an investment, but I have to say it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Robert and Pornapit, and thank you for the questions. I'd now like to go to some questions from the audience, and we have one here from another valued member of our community of practice, Dr. Ravikun. Dr. Ravikun wants to know if the survey highlighted the status of the respondents and whether they're from public or private HEIs. So the survey hasn't been, or the study hasn't been released yet in the public domain. We hope to do that soon. But perhaps you can just give a bit more input on that, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Pornapit.
Yes, the first slide is that when we talk about institutional information, we have 68% from public university, private for non-profit. For not-profit is 23%, and private for profit is 8%. So it comes from private university as well. Yeah.
Okay, I think that addresses that question. We've another question here from, I believe, Gina. So we'll ask Robert and Pornapit for a little bit of advice on what SHARE can do to resolve the issues of differences in terms of semester starts among partner universities. So this is supposedly, and I think agreeably, a strong impact on harmonization and internationalization. That's from Gina at the University of Cambodia.
Yeah, first steps have been made already, for example, in the Philippines. So Philippines aligned its educational system to the others. But and it doesn't have to be one-to-one with regard to the time schedule. There can be slight differences, but it shouldn't be too wide. So normally you would say, okay, keep within a certain limits with regard to your time schedule, because it's very helpful in internationalization. It's very helpful with regard to internationalization when you have least sufficient common ground. 1 week or 2 weeks difference doesn't really matter. But if it becomes wider, of course, then it becomes problematic. It can still be solved, but it takes too much investment and too much time. So their SHARE, but also other programs, of course, can help, but the particular SHARE, because it also tries to organize this. But of course, there is a national responsibility here, and there's the responsibility of the individual institutions. And this has to be solved together. And that's why it's very important to have a shared platform, at least to identify the issues, because if you don't identify them, you can't solve them. But then you can ask countries, institutions to come up with proposals. Again, we went through the same process in Europe, and it took us some time. But in the end, everybody agreed that we should align in one way or another within certain borders these time schedules. And we made step forwards. Took time. It always takes time. But as a result, of course, yeah, we have now one shared system, more or less, or at least we have a lot of overlap, which allows for cooperation.
We've another good question here from Fillmore, who says he's a believer of virtual internationalization, be it virtual exchange, virtual mobility, and believes it addresses inclusivity and limitations. How has the study reflected on this?
From the study, we found that many universities stated that more students are involved in virtual mobility, and because they don't have to pay for the accommodation and everything, so they are more interested in joining virtual lectures and some other activities, which I think which is good. So what I think is that even maybe after post-COVID, we should still think about this as well, not just think about physical mobility or so this should go hand in hand with physical mobility.
No, I think what is very positive is that the platforms we're using nowadays have been developed so far much more than they were in the past. In the past, it was only an instrument in which you could share information. But now, of course, with breakout rooms and all kinds of technological answers to have an active classroom. Of course, we are in a far better position than we were 5 or 10 years ago. Because that of course is a weakness. People need other people, need the social environment. But what we learned also in COVID times all over the world, that if you have breakout rooms, you bring students together, small groups, having discussions within those groups, you have more or less the same, you come very close to the effect of having a normal classroom. And indeed, what the research shows is that it boosts inclusiveness. Many more people involved. They feel part of a larger group. There are limitations, but limitations are not that large anymore as they were in the past because of these facilities we have today.
Okay. I'll take one more question from the audience, and this is from another member of our community of practice. What crucial strategies engage students in internationalization? So has virtual exchange or the digital modalities sought to engage students more, or is it having the opposite effect?
What crucial strategies? I think maybe it should be some encouragement from the internationalization actors, because as you see that from the study, you can see that I show that there are many people who are active. Who are active actors of internationalization, starting from the president until the students. So if you ask about crucial strategy, I think a lot of encouragement, sharing sessions for those who already have some experiences. This kind of thing would be good to encourage other students to be involved in internationalization activities. This is from my view. Robert, do you have?
Yeah, I think you require a step-by-step approach. You can imagine that you set up a lecture series, an international lecture series. That's what we do, for example, at the moment. And you invite people, colleagues who are informed in such a lecture series. So people get used to people from other, students get used to people from experts from other countries. But you can build on this. So you can lay out a strategy which will be effective in terms of inclusiveness, of raising awareness about that it is important to take notice of the opinions of others from other countries, for example, and bring also up issues which might not be discussed at the moment in your institution, but might be discussed in another institution. So you can widen your circle of expertise in a very effective way. And of course, in return, of course, you can offer to other institutions your expertise. So it's a win-win. It's a win-win situation in the end.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Pornapit. I'd like to go to our community of practice panelists for their final thoughts on this and any reflections they have on the study. So perhaps we could start with Dr. Susanto, then Dr. Tatum, and Ms. Sukulin, please. Or in a different order, if you prefer.
Okay. May I start?
Please.
Yeah, I think this is an important study because I think there are many difficulties in crossing the boundaries between higher institutions in Southeast Asia, especially because, as you have noted, that we have different systems, different times, different languages. And I think one of the biggest questions will be also how to break down the barrier of prestige that we like to give into internationalization effort and turn it into something that is more value oriented. If this can be endorsed and there are more recommendations to how to increase the values of internationalization and make it a more common quest for higher education institutions around the regions, and not only for the few selected ones that have the opportunity. And as you point out, that this is not an equal quest for everybody in the region. I think this is a one step that can open the eyes of the stakeholders to make this as an opportunity for the students instead of only a quest for prestige, even for the ranking, even for the students to be bragging about, okay, I have an overseas degree, or something similar to that kind of thing. Hopefully that this
It's an
will
excellent
open
point. Yeah. There's a great need for more inclusion in internationalization, and we're currently doing a series of workshops with the Asia Europe Foundation addressing precisely that. Sukalin or Dr. Susanto, your final comments. Thank you very much, Dr. Susanto.
Okay, my mic is okay. Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Darren. I would like to appreciate this wonderful study. It is very influential, I think. And then we are in especially in Indonesia, would like to have more actions. And then it is very nice to know the recommendation and many things that we can do, especially for higher education institution in Indonesia. And regarding about internationalization, especially focusing on the student mobility and also the scholars mobility, I think it is one of the key points to spread the ideas regarding about the internationalization and the harmonization within this Asian region. Congratulations for the study. Would like to have more action, especially for the next step of this study. Congratulations, Robert and Panabit. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Susanto. And over to you for the final word, Sukalin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to mention only one thing, that don't forget that this group of people that also working for internationalization, supporting staff. Okay, we have the good lecturers, good students, but don't forget about supporting staff for non-teaching staff mobility. I really like the idea of like Erasmus Plus that also allow like non-teaching staff to mobilize among the ASEAN countries. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's an important point that there shouldn't really be a distinction. We're all international education practitioners, no matter which end of the internationalization issue we're sitting. I would like to thank our experts, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Pornapit, for their time and efforts on this study. We're looking forward to publishing it very soon. So you can all read, it'll be available in the public domain. And a special word of thanks to our, I think, first such volunteers for our community of practice Q&A session on a study. I think it was a really engaging session as a result. And thank you all for your questions on the session. As I mentioned, we're having another session now, which our experts have very kindly agreed to do. It's on the Hop-In platform, and you'll receive a link to that on the Hop-In platform. So please do join us there, and feel free to put your questions to our experts, but also our community of practice members. My apologies for running slightly over time and eating into that period, but let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session tomorrow, same time, on the same platform. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.